The Center for Research in Post-Humanities, Bankura University presents a two-day international conference on post-human condition in the Anthropocene, 2nd and March 3, 2024. Harman, philosopher and distinguished professor of philosophy, Southern California Institute of Architecture, Los Angeles is going to deliver the keynote address on the politics of things. Status report.
Uh, we are going to begin our first session in our two-day international conference on post-human condition in the Anthropocene. And Professor Harman is our speaker of the second day. Now it's my pleasure and an honor to introduce Professor Harman. Professor Harman is an esteemed American philosopher renowned for his contributions to metaphysics of objects and the development of object-oriented ontology. Currently serving as Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. He has played a pivotal role in shaping the speculative realism movement within contemporary philosophy. Previously, Harman was the Distinguished University Professor at the American University of Cairo, where he taught from 2000 to 2016. He has also imparted his expertise as a visiting faculty member at esteemed institutions such as University of Amsterdam, University of Innsbruck, University of Turin, and Yale University. Since 2013, he has been a faculty member at the European Graduate School. Grounded in Martin Heidegger's concept of tool analysis from being and time, Harman's work emphasizes the autonomy of objects, critiquing phenomenology for its human-centered perspective. As a leading figure in speculative realism, he challenges anthropocentric philosophies by advocating for metaphysical realism and rejecting co-relationism, a notion prevalent in post-Kantian philosophy. Among his notable publications are Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political, Is There an Object-Oriented Architecture, Engaging Harman, Architecture and Object. He has also authored countless monographs and countless research journals. Now I hand over the intervirtual platform to Professor Harman.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back. I was here shortly after the death of Bruno Latour in 2022, and I think I discussed some of those themes then, but I'm going to be talking about politics in the post-human period. And I'm going to start by talking about the problems with the left-right distinction. In the modern period, of course, we are accustomed to assessing everyone we meet as being somewhere along a spectrum between left and right. How radical are they? Are they closer to the center? And I think there's a deeper philosophical problem with this difference, which is that it ultimately hinges on different theories of human nature. And I'm going to try to move us away from that tonight. In the words of Carl Schmitt, himself one of the leading right-wing political philosophers, actually a Nazi, he said something very interesting in his work, The Concept of the Political. One could test all theories of state and political ideas according to their anthropology, and thereby classify these as to whether they consciously or unconsciously presuppose man to be by nature evil or by nature good, by their answer to the question whether man is a dangerous being or not, a risky or a harmless creature. And right there you have the difference between the left and the right in a nutshell. On the left, we have this idea of humans as naturally good and as somehow messed up by some oppressive force, whether it be a hostile class that is sucking surplus value off of us, or whether it's society, which emerged inevitably from agriculture and metallurgy. So there you've got examples of Marx and Rousseau. And so there is also a sense of humans are naturally equal, one of the mainstays of the left. And so on that side, you've got one particular theory of human nature backing a whole wing of political thought, the left, whether it's Marxist, Rousseauian, or some other variants. And of course, on the right, you have the opposite idea, as Schmitt said, that humans are dangerous creatures, that they are not to be trusted, that they need more oppression if they are going to be their best selves, rather than being murderers, rapists, thieves, beginners of wars. And so we have names here such as Machiavelli, Hobbes, and of course, Carl Schmitt. Now, that in itself, those two lists contain some fairly interesting thinkers, the main thinkers who will be read in a university class on political theory, along with a few more contemporary ones. One of the things that attracts me most to Bruno Latour as a philosopher is his growing realization throughout his career that there's a problem with both of these theories, both of these basic political orientations, left and right. And that problem for him, as I've just mentioned, for me, is that political theory is usually centered in a specific theory of human nature. And this is something Latour tried to move away from in various stages through the latter part of his career. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the ideas that arise for this. He did make an interesting comment about the left-right distinction, which is that paradoxically, you almost always learn more about politics from the reactionaries, from the right-wing people, than from the good guys. Why is that? Why is it that you are likely to learn more practical techniques for doing politics from Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Schmitt than from Rousseau and Marx, even if Rousseau and Marx seem to have a more favorable idea of human nature? That's probably the very reason. There's a tendency on the left to think that making a moral call to the populace is a large part of the work of politics, whereas the right is probably more aware of the fact that you need to make sure that the power is on your side and not the other side. So, for instance, to take the relatively tame example of the United States, although we may have more bad consequences this year, you see the Democratic Party is not being as good at politics as the Republican Party. The Republican Party is actually better at exploiting certain issues to turn out their base, to infuriate certain people about certain issues that they want to be infuriated. Whereas the Democratic Party seems too convinced of the truth of Martin Luther King Jr.'s adage that the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. Somehow history is on our side because the nature of things is on our side. And over time, oppressive structures will be overthrown and the people will be empowered. Well, that's not necessarily true. Let me get back to the left-right issue again, because David Graeber and David Wengrow, not so long ago, wrote a best-selling book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. And I had been waiting this book for several years after reading an earlier article by Wengrow about how Rousseau's conception of prehistory was basically wrong, and that the new pieces for a new history of the world had been around for a long time, and it was time to act on them. And so then after his death, when I heard this book was coming out, I was very excited about it. And of course, there is a lot of imaginative stuff in Graeber and Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything. They even make the same critique I do of modern political theory. And I hadn't seen this when I wrote Bruno Latour Assembling the Political, which I published 10 years ago. So this was, and I doubt they read my book, so I think this was just an accidental coincidence. That Graeber and Wengrow complain about the stale alternative between Rousseau and Hobbes, as they put it. The idea that humans are either naturally good or naturally evil. And to their credit, they're anarchists, they're on the left, but to their credit, they go through and give some actual examples of horrible, barbaric behavior from non-Western peoples. So they are willing to depart from the usual narrative that people are naturally good and it's mostly Western imperialism that causes all the problems. They're willing to catalog a full range of atrocities from around the world. Now, of course, their solution to what humans naturally are is not that humans are naturally good or evil, but that humans are naturally imaginative and experimental. So humans have experimented with dictatorships. They've experimented with egalitarian forms of government. They've experimented with women being in charge. They've experimented with the youth being in charge. They find in the anthropological records a much more imaginative set of options in politics. And one of the things this does is it suggests that all humans have to do is get together and use their imagination and come up with something else. That the idea that certain forms of government are forced upon us by the nature of reality, they want us to be a bit more imaginative. All right, but there's obviously a problem with this, which is that it leaves human beings at the center of things. Instead of a naturally good human or a naturally evil human, we have a naturally experimental human. And So it's still humans who are in charge. And these are all forms of modern philosophy. And it's not only modern political theory that puts too much of the power in the hands of humans. It's also modern philosophy more generally, as object-oriented ontology has long argued, that the basic idea behind modern philosophy is what I and Nikki Young have called ontotaxonomy, the idea that there are two basic kinds of things. First, human thought, and second, everything else. Human thought is taken to be something so unique in kind, or perhaps human language or human history, that we are treated effectively as half of the cosmos. And some people are very attached to this. Some people will be very insulting when they hear that object-oriented ontology wants to make away with that fundamental distinction. They will say that just at the moment when people other than white males are taking power, we want to change the subject from humans to non-humans. Well, that's not really it. The idea is that it's not really a good idea for anyone to want to be a supreme cogito ruling over all the other cogitos. That politics cannot really be defined by the power of a certain human or type of human who is in charge. What we need in place of left and right is not centrism, but something more radical than human nature. And this is why I'm going to start again with Bruno Latour, because he's done so much to advance this topic through several stages of his career. And I will tell again a story I've told before in print and orally. That story is that some years ago, it's probably 12 years ago now, Pluto Press in London wrote to me and asked for my recommendation on who should write a book about Bruno Latour's political philosophy. And so I spent a couple of hours thinking about who would be the right person to ask for this, when suddenly I realized, wait a minute, I want this. I want to do this. Because I want to learn what Bruno Latour's political philosophy is. I had been working on him for 14 years at that point, and his political remarks were scattered throughout his book. They weren't as developed in 2012 as they were at the end of his life. And so it was a somewhat scattered and uncertain topic. And even Latour himself, once the book was published, said that he didn't know what his political philosophy was either until I published that book. So it was also a matter of confusion to him. He didn't normally orient his work along political lines. He was primarily a social theorist and an anthropologist, not always recognized as a philosopher. And in terms of his own political commitments, they weren't that radical. I would say he was a kind of center-left liberal, not a neoliberal, for reasons I'll say in a moment. And so his politics, if you talk to him in person, weren't necessarily that exciting. You might agree with him, but he wasn't someone taking radical positions on most things. Later, he would do so on the environment and climate change. But this was the Latour of about a decade and a half earlier. And anyway, this went out to a reviewer. My proposal, or went out to 4 reviewers who all gave very, very helpful comments. But one of them said, I'm happy for Harman to write this book, but I don't think he's going to find anything in Latour's politics other than might makes right. Kind of philosophy in which politics means power, and whoever has the power is lucky. And that's just the way it is. You have to fight for the power. And as I went back through and covered reviewed the whole of Latour's career, I could see why they thought that. If you go back to the early writings in Latour's career, he's primarily a Hobbesian. And Hobbes, of course, was someone who thought that the sovereign needs absolute power. There can be no competitors for that power, whether it be religion or even science. The sovereign has to have the ultimate authority on what counts as acceptable religion, what counts as acceptable science. And of course, some people have even read, although Hobbes is a very hardcore person, advocates the use of force in controlling the society, a plausible case has been made that Hobbes is also the founder of liberalism, in the sense that in liberalism, life is supposed to be somewhat depoliticized, right? There isn't a radical choice between radically different parties. Usually in liberal countries, there's two or more parties that tend to cluster closer to the center, especially in the United States until recently. And we're supposed to focus on shopping and on cultural things. This is supposed to be the nature of life. And the police protect us from criminals in our midst, and the armed forces protect us from the state of nature on the international stage. And this is the way in which you can see that Hobbes is in a way, the founder of liberalism. And it's interesting that both the left and the right agree in their critique of this outlook on reality. That why is it that so many leftists, so many Marxists admire Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi? Well, what Schmitt shares in common with the leftists is his view that politics is essentially violence, politics is a struggle against the enemy. And of course, for Schmitt, it's more about the foreign enemy, whereas for Marxists, it's more about the class enemy. It's more internationalized. All right. Latour is certainly very much on the liberal side in that dispute, not on the Marxist side and not on the Schmittian side. But in early career of Latour, you can see this pronounced Hobbesian element, that there is a sense in which for the early Latour, might makes right. That politics is trumps knowledge. And that is not just Latour, that's a lot of people in science studies, a lot of people in the more social constructionist mode of science studies. For instance, in Chapin and Schaefer's book, Leviathan and the Air Pump, where they're covering the dispute between Thomas Hobbes and the natural scientist Robert Boyle. And it turns out that Hobbes and Boyle agree on most things about politics and about science and religion, religion more. But it turns out that there's a big dispute between them over what counts as reliable support for a scientific statement. And Chapin and Schaefer end up concluding their book by saying Hobbes was right. And Latour in 1991, We Have Never Been Modern, the French edition, says, no, Hobbes was not right. And that is a key moment in Latour's career. Because Latour says there, if you're going to deconstruct science, you also have to deconstruct power. Power is not this natural and obvious thing to us any more than knowledge is. And that the problem with the social constructionists in science studies is that they want to take power as an ultimate transparent term that explains everything. And so Latour at this moment is essentially abandoning whatever there was in him of the power politician. He wants to start looking at nature as a political actor as well, and as a scientific actor. Nature is something that intrudes on experiments so that they can't just say whatever we want them to say, that makes of science something other than power politics. And I don't think Latour ever totally lost the reputation of a power politics social constructionist guy among natural scientists. He remains unpopular with that group to this day. This was essentially the beginning of his road to what he called, to not me, object-oriented politics in his book concerning an inquiry into the different modes of existence, 2012 in French. That was 21 years after We Have Never Been Modern. And we'll get to what he says in that book. But it's interesting that he's already taking a step away from this idea that power is everything. That many more mediators come into the political sphere and take away this idea that everything is just about a power struggle. Per Schouten, the young Dutch political philosopher, reminded us in his article in 2013, it's about the materiality of state failure in the Congo, but it has a very impressive reflection on Latour. And I owe to Schouten a lot of the ideas, a lot of the foundational ideas of my book on Latour's politics. He points us back to an article co-authored by Latour as far back as 1987 with the primatologist Shirley Strum at the University of California at San Diego. Strum is a primatologist, so she's an expert on primates, needless to say. And she and Latour co-authored an article on baboons in 1987. I've forgotten where they traveled, but Strum allowed Latour to come along on some of her field work and observe baboons in action. And their surprising conclusion, which cuts against the grain of social constructionism, is that baboons are actually more social than we are. Baboons are more constantly watching each other to see what's the pecking order, what's the hierarchy today, has it shifted, which apes are mating now that maybe weren't mating before, which baboons are massaging each other or friends with each other. And when the whole group of baboons moves on, all the other baboons will follow the group, even if they have to give up something very good to do that, like a rich food source they had just found. So baboons are completely tied to their social group. And of course, not all animals are like that, but many animals are like that, wolves being another example. So that's baboons. Now, Aristotle and others will tell us that humans are social animals. And so we might think by looking at baboons, we can see what humans are like. And sure, there's a lot of hierarchy, there's a lot of groupthink among humans. But it's not quite like that with humans. We have a bit more autonomy and independence from each other than that, even if it doesn't go that far. in the sense that when I wake up in the morning or when you wake up in the morning, we know who we are. We know our names. We know our government's identity number. We know roughly how much money we have in the bank if we need to use it. We know where we live. We have keys that only allow us and our family into our living space. We know our profession. I woke up today knowing I was giving this lecture tonight across the world, thanks to the magic of technology. And Latour's point is that it's much of this stability in the human sphere is provided by inanimate objects. So I wake up. I have a wedding ring on. This symbolizes that I'm married. It symbolizes to anybody who sees it that I'm married. I have keys to various things like my apartments, my car, my office. This not only symbolizes, but technically ensures that I'm the only one who has access to those, along with a few others who do, like my wife and then my office mate at the office. There are Maurizio Ferraris, the Italian realist philosopher, has written a whole book on documentality. That what holds all of society together are documents. And so the more you start to look at it, there are fences, there are security guards, there are all of these things that ensure that we only go to places where we belong and that access is restricted to certain things. And there may be a hierarchy among humans, but that hierarchy is ensured by a number of inanimate technologies. These are non-human things. So in other words, we have to stop looking at the political sphere as one that is just made of either good, evil, or imaginative humans. A lot of the things that structure the political space aren't even humans. And some of them we set up, some of them we didn't. So that's the first step on Latour's path. One of the things that affected him in the next stage of his path, when he published the book Politics of Nature, I think that was 1999 in French and 2004 in English. And in that book, for the first time, he started treating moralists with respect. Latour, in his early years, always described moralists, people who simply complain that certain political things are immoral, as cutting a rather sorry figure. His point at the time was that essentially might does make right, and even if you're right, if you know in your heart of hearts that you're politically right, it does no good to anybody unless you can actually arrange the what it takes to win the election. And so we're having this debate now in the United States as regards Joe Biden, where Biden has lost quite a bit of his support by being what many people considered too supportive of Benjamin Netanyahu in the Gaza war, giving him too much of a green light or blank check to do whatever he wants. Whereas moralists more on the American left, or the left wing of the Democratic Party even, consider that to be an ongoing series of war crimes and human rights abuses. And so they're voting not to support Biden in the Democratic primaries and so forth. And the counter argument to that is, look, we have to beat Trump. This is no time to complain, even if it seems like a war crime to you. That's the wing that Latour, frankly, would have been in the 1980s. The idea that you have to do what it takes to build a coalition to win, otherwise nothing's going to do any good for anybody. And this is why he actually described the moralist in his book Politics of Nature, or in earlier books, as being somewhat pathetic. That changes in the Politics of Nature. In the Politics of Nature, he says the moralist detects previously unknown entities in the ethical and political sphere, just as the scientist detects previously unknown entities in the natural sphere. So scientists are out there finding quarks for us and Higgs boson and whatever other particles or biological entities we did not know existed. This is the job of the scientist. The job of the scientist is to establish the existence of these new things, whereas the job of the political moralist is to draw our attention to things that have been oppressed or excluded by the political system. And there will always be more. In the United States, we went through this very dramatic shift that has not happened in all countries, of course, where gay marriage was not supported by most people. And then in the course of a few years, it was supported by a pretty sizable majority. And there's probably a good book that could be written about why that happens. One of the interesting things about it is that it didn't happen from old people dying off, unlike most political changes. For some reason, Americans across all age groups decided in pretty high percentages that they thought it was more fair to let gay people actually have marriage rights. So that's an example of what Latour would call a moral phenomenon. Even if someone personally thought it was immoral, within the American polity, it was decided that it was not moral to not let gay couples, for one of them to inherit the property from someone else after they die, or not be able to visit them in the hospital. These were considered moral concerns. And so Latour starts warming to these moral approaches to politics that he normally describes. He always remains somewhat hesitant about it, and we'll get back to that in a second. But in the period after Politics of Nature, Latour was deeply influenced by one of his students, a Dutch woman named Noortje Morris, who has been teaching in the UK for many years. She now teaches at Warwick, and she's written some excellent stuff on political philosophy. She was a student of Latour at the London School of Economics. And what she invited Latour to do was to take the old Lippmann-Dewey debate seriously. Now, you probably all know who John Dewey was, major American philosopher who wrote a book called The Public and Its Problems. That was in response to Walter Lippmann, famous American journalist of the time, early 20th century. And Lippmann, in some ways, had some cynical observations to make about American democracy. The ideology in America is that we have public education because we need an educated voting public to make the right decisions. Since the people are ruling our country, we need people to know what they're doing and to be trained to be good citizens so they can vote correctly. And what Lippmann said to this is, hardly. Most of the people in the American public are completely ignorant about political affairs. They don't even have time to study politics. They're lucky if they can find where their next meal is coming from. And so inevitably, America will have to march towards a technocratic government or rule by experts. Dewey's response to this was much more optimistic. Dewey's response was essentially, yes, Lippmann has a point. People are not always as educated as they ought to be to vote in a democracy, but they don't have to be. Dewey argued that it's enough for people to be interested in a small number of political issues that interest them or that affect them directly. And we call them stakeholders now, people who are concerned about specific issues. And so, no, I don't have time to become educated about all issues. I don't even care about all political issues. But there are some I really do care about. And there may be a few that concern everybody, such as defense policy, healthcare policy, climate change policy. But in practice, there's always only a certain percentage of the population and maybe certain corporate entities, certain government agencies that actually care to put in the time to talk about these things. And so Dewey's idea was that a kind of miniature public or a medium-sized public mobilizes around any given political issue. And that with respect to that issue, all we can ever hope to do is reach a consensus or a decision. We are never going to gain absolute knowledge of any issue. Politics is not a kind of knowledge, fundamentally, the way that science aspires to be. That we, for instance, look at nuclear power. Even on the left, nuclear power is an object of controversy. There are some people who believe it's our last best chance to escape global warming since it doesn't release CO2. Then there are others who are far more horrified about Chernobyl and Fukushima and the terrible environmental disasters that resulted in perhaps terroristic acts against nuclear power and so forth. So even on the left, that's controversial. And so we're never going to reach a definitive solution about that. That's what politics is, according to the understanding reached by Noortje Morris and Bruno Latour. This would have been in the early 21st century. And by then, well, let me give you a contrast. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the physicist who's also the new host of the show Cosmos. I don't know if the show Cosmos shows in India, but it was the one that Carl Sagan hosted for years in the United States, and now it's Neil deGrasse Tyson. And Neil deGrasse Tyson put up a tweet a couple summers ago that said he proposes a new country called Rationalia, a country of rational people that will have a one-line constitution. And that one line will be, all disputes will be settled by the weight of evidence. It's a nice thought, but what does political evidence mean? Political evidence isn't quite the same as scientific evidence. And even in the case of scientific evidence, there are always dissenters. You can still find a few scientists who don't think HIV is the cause of AIDS. You can still find 3% of scientists who don't believe climate change is occurring. So there are outliers even in the sciences. In politics, it's going to be far more disputed than that. So let's take a couple of controversial examples. Let's look at the war between Russia and Ukraine. For Western liberals, that is an open and shut case, right? That Ukraine was invaded unprovoked. Putin is doing something evil here. He must be stopped, or he's going to do it to many other countries. And in the United States, there is sympathy for self-determination, although only when it suits us. The United States doesn't always want self-determination for countries if it turns out differently than the United States wants. But fundamentally, the ultimate pillar of United States foreign policy is that what is really the only realistic threat to the United States security-wise? According to most U.S. foreign policy professionals, it's the idea of Europe, one of the wealthiest parts of the world, being taken over by a hostile power, say with Hitler, or say with Stalin. If you have a Hitler or a Stalin or even a Putin somehow in control of one of the richest parts of the world, then you could have a realistic threat to the land security of the United States. Okay, that's our political stance from where we are on the globe and from what our situation is. If you look at Russia, Russia's primary national security interest has always been having a lot of land to burn so that they can retreat from Napoleon or from Hitler or whoever's attacking them. Originally, they had to deal with the Mongols, and they were being beaten up by the Mongols regularly until Ivan the Terrible started using modern artillery. And so for Russia, there's been this tragic history of being invaded a lot, and their ultimate recourse has been to have a lot of territory. Now, this doesn't justify the nature of their assault on Ukraine, but you can see why they want Ukraine to remain within the Russian orbit. The closest border of Ukraine is maybe 250 miles from Moscow. And so if you start looking at the situation in political terms rather than moral ones, as the media does, you can start to see Russian foreign policy making a bit more sense, even if you don't like the means they are using to carry it out. Means that you might easily call immoral and that I would denounce myself. But that's an example of how politics cannot be reduced to rational evidence in the way that Neil deGrasse Tyson likes. And Dewey, as a liberal, is one person who saw that by saying all the different people concerned have to gather around the issue and reach a consensus or a compromise. It's also the view of Carl Schmitt, which is that no one can decide what the sovereign does except for the sovereign. That a people has the absolute right to decide to make the decision between friend and enemy and to fight the enemy, not to annihilate them, but just to stop them from being a threat to our own way of life. So I'll bring up another current controversial situation, the war in Gaza. I'm guessing that Schmitt would probably analyze the war in Gaza not in moral terms, not in terms of look at this horrible massacre carried out by Hamas, or look at the excessive response of Israel in bombing the civilians in Gaza to rubble. Schmitt wouldn't look at it like that. Schmitt would no doubt look at it as the struggle of two people who both believe they have a rightful claim to the same piece of land, or at least to certain parts of that land. And so Schmitt would probably say it's no one's business on the outside to get involved. It's a life or death struggle for those two peoples. And we can decide to support one side or the other, but we can't sit on the sidelines and make moral judgments when people are fighting for their very existence. Now that's Schmitt. Okay, so what is the fate of Schmitt in Latour's system? This is very interesting. Latour never really reconciled his late modes of existence system with his earlier actor-network system. Of course, the actor-network theory of Latour is about arranging things in a network to try to attain more strength or power than you had otherwise. It should be a heterogeneous array of human and non-human actors who strengthen you. Instead of trying to purify yourself and getting rid of all outside forces, you're supposed to try to assemble a motley assortment of different allies and resources. By contrast, the modes of existence period of Latour, it's not even a period, it's a side of Latour. It started way back in the 80s, but wasn't published until 2012 in French and 2013 in English. And the idea there is that actor networks have a big problem. That actor networks are simply talking about how all these different heterogeneous things intersect. It doesn't allow for the fact that there are different zones of reality, each with their own standards of truth. And I'll talk about that now in a second. And Latour, in his later period in his career, when he was going to start talking about climate change a lot and start talking about Gaia theory, which we'll also discuss, that in that case, Latour wasn't using his modes of existence he was going back to actor-network theory. You don't find much mention, if at all, of his modes of existence theories in the work on Gaia, or the book he wrote, the short book he wrote on Donald Trump, or mostly about Donald Trump. And so in a way, Latour kind of jumps back and forth between those. And people are interested in the modes of existence book, but people haven't really figured it out. And so you see people experimenting with it, playing around with it a little bit, but you don't see such a sizable body of scholarship on the Latour of modes of existence as you do on the Latour of actor-network theory. And I'll say it's partly my fault, because I was supposed to publish this book on modes of existence way back in 2014. I got sidetracked. This book is going to be at least a decade late, but I'm just starting on it again. But what's going on in his... Well, actually, let's start with the modes of existence and then go to the climate politics, because that's kind of how he did it. Modes of existence. Latour says, essentially in the modern period, science has a monopoly on truth. Just as that tweet from Neil deGrasse Tyson said, oh, if you want good politics, you should just have a constitution based on rationality. And everybody should be rational and make rational decisions based on evidence. Okay, it sounds good. But what exactly does rational political evidence look like? It seems like Tyson here is trying to imply that all political disputes are simply petty and selfish and could be solved if rational people would simply sit down with goodwill and agree to get along with each other. That's, Latour would say, is a fairly naive idea of politics. Latour would say that peace is not with people who come to a rational understanding. Peace comes between enemies. Peace becomes between people of ill will, people who would rather fight but realize that they shouldn't fight. It's not in the good of their communities, their societies. One of the classic examples, since I lived in Egypt for so many years, in 1973, we had the famous so-called Yom Kippur War. Especially interesting for me because since I was living in Egypt, I got to meet a number of the Egyptian officers and even frontline soldiers who fought in that war. I talked to the lead war planners for that war in Egypt. They happened to be at the same party I was, and these were very intelligent and interesting people. And they said, as soon as President Nasser died in Egypt, Sadat came to us and asked us bluntly, tell me the truth, don't exaggerate. What is the best that we Egypts can do in a war with Israel if we beef up our defenses? Because their defense, especially their air force, had been completely wiped out in the 1967 war. They needed to rebuild it all. And the generals told him honestly, we think we can cross the Suez Canal and hold some territory. Israel was still occupying the Suez Canal then as a result of the 1967 war. And Sadat said, okay, that will be our plan. Keep it a secret. Our goal will be in the next 5 to 7 years to cross the Suez Canal and seize some territory from Israel. That's what happened. It was a surprise attack. I even met one of the Egyptian Navy SEALs who was on the front line and crossed and actually killed some Israeli soldiers and was still somewhat disturbed about it to that point in time, 28 years later. As you may recall, Egypt made quite a lot of progress in the Sinai. The Israelis under Ariel Sharon did an armored counterattack and crossed back over the Suez and got pretty close to the outskirts of Cairo. At that point, a ceasefire was reached. Israel was demanding that Sadat cross back over the Suez. And the American government told Israel that's not going to happen. Sadat will be hanged. Look at this as an opportunity instead, because now Sadat can claim he won a war against Israel. He's in a position to make a peace treaty with Israel. And so Egypt and Israel can stop bombing each other every week as they've been doing for the past 5 years. And this led to Sadat making his famous trip to Jerusalem and led to the Camp David peace treaty. And to this day, there's a cold peace between Egypt and Israel, but it's a peace. Generations of Egyptians and Israelis have grown up now not having to worry about being bombed by the other side. Obviously, there's a lot of resentment on the two sides towards each other, especially in the public, but the governments are not at war with each other for now. Let's hope it stays that way. It's better for the Middle East not to have those two countries at war, although you find many on the far right on both sides that would like there to be a war. There were people who would like open conflict between the two sides. And in fact, Sadat was assassinated by the religious right in Egypt for having dared to make peace with Israel. Whatever you think about all of that, that is what I would call a political act. I think Sadat was a very clever politician. Sadat realized, I don't know whether he wanted to destroy Israel. He realized it was not militarily feasible. So he asked himself, what can Egypt get out of this that will make life better for Egypt? Well, one would be a peace that allows many generations of Egyptians to grow up without being bombed needlessly, and also a way to get the Sinai Peninsula back for Egypt, which is a wonderful piece of geography, and it's now part of Egypt again, thanks to the peace treaty. That's a political act. Another example of a political act on the United States side, Richard Nixon, who as a congressman made his career as a hater of Red China or Communist China, was the one who made peace with China starting in 1972 as a rather brilliant way of isolating the Soviet Union during the end of the Cold War. That is also a very brilliant political act, although some people to Nixon's right in the Republican Party weren't happy with it. And we go back a little further for my final example, the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was essentially a Catholic versus Protestant religious war, with the exception of France, which Catholic majority country, stayed out of the war until they could see which way the winds were blowing, and then jumped in on the Protestant side, betraying their fellow Catholics. Cardinal Richelieu, who was then the leader of France because the king was still a child, said he did so for reasons of state. This tilted the balance of the war. It permanently weakened Spain and Austria and permanently made France the most powerful Catholic country in Europe. In fact, France, I think, is still the only Catholic country with an atomic bomb. So of all majority Catholic countries in the world, France is still the strongest in military and economic terms. So Richelieu's decision, although it was a stab in the back to the Catholic Church and the Pope, and Richelieu wasn't just a Catholic, he was even a cardinal. He was a high-ranking official in the Catholic Church. He was willing to do that for reasons of state to help France. And if you are French, you have benefited for the last 4 centuries from that decision, as amoral as it might look. It wasn't a moral act, Richelieu betraying his national friends. It was a political act that was for the good of his country. And if you start going through history, you're going to find more examples like this of acts that were purely political, risky, and had a very nice benefit. And what does Latour say about these different modes in his book, Modes of Existence? Well, the first thing he does, he's got 15 modes. There are actually 14. Don't believe the mode double click. Double click is not a mode. Double click is the idea that you just click twice on something and you get all the knowledge about it you need. Whereas, of course, Latour's concept of knowledge is that it's heavily mediated. You need to link lots of things together in order to gain anything even remotely resembling knowledge. So that's the first task of his book, is to essentially disarm science's modern monopoly on truth. He dissolves science into 3 different modes. Then comes a set of 3 modes that he thinks have conditions of truth that are different from science and should not be ruled over by science. And those are politics, law, and religion. And it's best to start with law because it's easiest to persuade people that he's right about law. Everyone knows that law makes use of scientific fact, and law might sometimes be manipulated for political reasons, or law might sometimes be distorted by religious concerns in any particular country. But ideally, law works in a self-contained way. And we do use scientific facts in law. We use, at least in the United States, DNA evidence is now a major factor in criminal trials in determining who is guilty and who's not. The technology, as it advances, DNA becomes more and more of an element in criminal trials. But does this mean that courtroom trials simply become replaced by scientific experiments? Absolutely not. Because what will the defense lawyer do? The defense lawyer will seek to have the DNA test thrown out because the police are lying. They already decided this person was guilty and they're faking DNA evidence to make them be found guilty. Or they will say that the police were racist, for example, and so put a black man's DNA at the scene of the crime. This came up in the famous O.J. Simpson trial in the 1990s. Or they will claim that the laboratory was sloppy and they didn't keep things clean and DNA samples were cross-contaminated. And a judge might rule in the defense's favor. The judge might and often does rule that certain pieces of scientific evidence cannot be included in the trial, either because the science was faulty, because the evidence was obtained illegally. Maybe the police broke into somebody's house and took the DNA sample, which they're not allowed to do without a judge's permission. And sometimes the judge does not even allow the prosecutors to talk about past crimes committed by the defendants. if they think that might unfairly prejudice the jury against the defendants. And so we are all aware that the legal mode of truth operates by different reasoning from all the others. It has its own way of deciding what is true or not. Another is that in courts, if the prosecution states a fact and the defense does not dispute it, it is assumed to be true, even if it's not true. Maybe the defense just forgot to dispute it. So that's another case of how the legal mode differs from the other modes. And Latour wrote a whole book, of course, called The Making of the Law, about how the Conseil d'État works in France. It's interesting and sometimes amusing. Well, now let's look at politics, since that's what concerns us tonight, mostly in this talk. What is the difference between politics and science? Well, we already saw that Neil deGrasse Tyson thinks we could have a purely rational country. Latour, Dewey, and Schmidt would all agree that you can't, right? There's a certain element of decision in politics that cannot be settled by rational facts. And here I'll give you another example from my years in Egypt. It's probable that if Egypt ever fights another war in the future, that it will not be with Israel, its traditional neighbor to the northeast. It is probable that it would be a war to the south, with countries such as Sudan and Ethiopia over water rights, especially as global warming continues and water becomes scarcer and as the populations of different countries continue to increase. Egypt's policy starting in the 1970s, Egypt did build a dam on the Nile in the 1950s, the Aswan High Dam. It generates electricity and does other things. That's in their own territory. But it's been Egyptian policy since, I believe, Sadat's era in the 1970s that if any other country tries to build a dam on the Nile, Egypt will destroy it. That will be considered cause of war. And at some point during my stay in Cairo, maybe even a little earlier, the sub-Saharan African countries involved, including Sudan and Ethiopia, but also now South Sudan, a new country on the Nile, began to push back and say, stop bullying us, stop treating us like children. You have to negotiate with us over the Nile water. And Egypt responds, well, we're a desert country. We're 98, 99% desert. The Nile is our only water. We need it. And we're also the most populous country in Africa. We cannot afford to give up any of this water. So you can't put a dam on it. And these sub-Saharan African countries respond, well, first of all, because Egyptians will say, we signed a treaty. All these countries signed a treaty saying we get this high percentage of Nile water. Well, then Ethiopia and Sudan say, yeah, but that treaty was signed under British colonialism. We are not bound by it. That was not us. That was the British pressuring us to do it. Okay. Then the Egyptians will say, we're a desert country with a lot of people. Ethiopia and Sudan will say, yes, but you're very inefficient at irrigating. You're wasting a lot of the Nile water by not irrigating properly. And Egypt will respond, yeah, but you are not irrigating properly either. You're also wasting a lot of water. And you have rainfall. And so this goes back and forth and back and forth. And of course, I was in Egypt, and so I tended to hear Egypt's side a lot. And so I became sympathetic to Egypt's side of the story over time. And I knew a lot more Egyptians than I did Ethiopians and Sudanese. But if you start pushing into the conflict far enough, you start to see that it isn't entirely clear who is in the right. It's not exactly clear. There's not a moral truth to who deserves what percentage of Nile water. That is a political dispute. And it's going to have to be settled politically. And part of that politics might include force, as politics often does, as one of the tools in the toolbox, however unfair that seems to us. And so this is what politics is about. It's not about morality. It's not about choosing the good person over the bad person. And I think this is one of the problems with the American political imagination. I say this as a native-born citizen of my country, that America has a tendency to confuse politics with morality, even if you think that certain political actions by America are immoral. The only way to get the American public interested in a war is by presenting one of the sides as evil. That's why World War II is our favorite war as a country. Maybe the Revolutionary War against the British, because we think we deserved our freedom, so the British were just wrong. We fought a revolution. World War II, we fought Hitler. Anybody can be proud of fighting Hitler, a bad guy. The wars that bother us a little more are ambiguous ones like Vietnam. Those cause more of a split in society. Was that really a necessary war that tends to split the right and the left in America? Or was it just a Vietnamese civil war that we should have stayed out of? America started off as an isolationist country that didn't want to get in the corrupt power politics wars of Europe. And then starting in World War I with Wilson, and especially in World War II with Roosevelt, intervention was treated by the American public as a moral imperative to make the world safe for democracy, to save the world from fascism, and in this case, to stop Putin from invading innocent countries in Eastern Europe and so forth. But Latour would say, in the more continental tradition of realpolitik, that politics is not about that. Politics is about making certain gestures that preserve or enhance a political space. And that is, we don't want to do immoral things as a rule, but it's not the same thing as science. It's not the same thing as morality. It's not the same thing as law, because even though we talk about international law, Latour seems to have at least a minimal sympathy with Schmitt's idea that sovereign countries get to decide their own needs when it comes to security and safety and the protection of their way of life, that it shouldn't be an international court ordering them not to fight this or that war. That's questionable, but there's some shred of sympathy in that for Latour. Now, so for national sovereignty. Religion, of course, sometimes gets mixed up in politics, and for Latour, that's also a problem. Latour's idea of religion is actually somewhat surprising. Religion is a mode of truth. Normally, the question of religion is fought on the same ground as science. You know, people will try to give either assert that they simply have faith in God no matter what, or they will try to give proofs for the existence of God or the truth of one religion. So they're fighting on the scientific terrain when they do that. Latour says religion is something different. It's more about mobilizing various human and non-human actors into a procession that's in movement. It gathers people around a certain idea of the transcendental. It's not about proving that there's actually a God that exists out there. And this is ironic because Latour, of course, was a very devout Catholic himself. And yet sometimes his definition of religion sounds a lot like Emile Durkheim's, the sociologist, which is that religion is simply a way of bringing people close together. It's not a transcendent truth. So in any case, politics, law, and religion for Latour are different from science and morality as different modes of existence and their own sense of meanings of truth. How much time do I have left?
Sir, we have 15 minutes more. 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll go about 15 minutes more. So the end of Latour's book on the different modes of existence is also intriguing because that's where he takes economics and decomposes it into three parts. Just a word on neoliberalism here. Sometimes enemies of Latour, intellectual enemies of Latour, who position themselves somewhere on the left will call him a neoliberal. That's just not accurate. First of all, the word neoliberal is not as precise as it needs to be. I think sometimes people say neoliberal when they mean capitalism. It's just a way of not pigeonholing oneself as an old-fashioned Marxist. They'll say neoliberal should really refer to free market economics of the Austrian and the Chicago school. Liberal is a different thing. Political liberal refers to someone who believes in elected democracy and perhaps some sort of mixed economy with human rights getting an emphasis as the basis of the political system. Latour is not a neoliberal. Latour is by no means an Anglo-Saxon free marketeer. And the proof of that is that he spends the whole latter part of the book on the modes of existence decomposing economics and saying that so-called economic reason flourishes only by covering over three true modes of existence: organization, attachment, and morality. Interestingly, morality. That even the most ruthless capitalist is probably going to pull up short of doing certain immoral things with their money. Some won't, but some people would at least feel hesitation. Here's an example. I don't know if this is still legal, but back in the 1990s, in the United States, you could buy what are called death futures. And the way death futures worked is, let's say somebody is dying of a terminal illness like cancer or AIDS or something really bad. And let's say they have a life insurance policy. And instead of leaving that life insurance policy to some family member after they die, they want access to the money themselves in order to go traveling or do something fun in their last months or year of life. So what death futures are is that an investor will give them, say, 60% of what the life insurance policy is going to be worth. And then the person has to sign over that when they die, the life insurance policy money goes to this investor. What that sets up is a situation where the investor is actively cheering for the person to die as fast as possible. Because if someone has $100,000 life insurance and you invest $60,000 in their death, give it to them, and they die the next day, you've made $40,000 in one day. It's a huge investment return. If they continue living for another 10 years, you've made a horrible investment. You've got a very low interest rate percentage. So it almost encourages investors to be very immoral and hoping for the swift death of somebody in order to earn more money. That's an example of something that even many hardcore capitalists would just say, I don't want to get involved in that. It's too creepy. And then even for people who would do that, you're going to find certain limits for almost all people. Certain things they will not do just to earn a profit. That's one of them. And then there's attachment and organization. I won't try to explain those here. But Latour ends up saying something surprising in that book. I mentioned how he despised moralists in his early career. And then in The Politics of Nature, he had started respecting moralists. At the end of The Different Modes of Existence, he ends up saying that morality is the highest principle of philosophy, because morality covers all of the different modes of existence. Every mode of existence has to be executed correctly, and that requires something like a morality, a sense of a propriety for the limits and the scope of action of each of the different modes. So politics shouldn't go too far for Latour. Politics should respect its limits and respect the law and respect religion and respect science. And so politics shouldn't run roughshod over those things. That's the kind of thing he means. So morality, in a sense, it's almost like Plato's idea of the good. Latour comes full circle, or half circle, I should say, 180 degrees, and ends up saying that morality is the highest principle of philosophy. This is at the end of the Modes book. But then, as mentioned, he doesn't go on to do that much with that. He doesn't write a lot more in the vein of the modes of existence. There's some, but not a lot. So I think he had as hard a time in figuring out where to go next with it as many people did. But now I want to talk about the other part of the remainder of Latour's career, which is discussion of climate politics. And there are several works about this topic. Most famously, he gave the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh about climate change. And the English title of the book is Facing Gaia. So with Gaia, he's talking about James Lovelock. Lovelock and Margulis's theory of Gaia, started by Lovelock, assisted by Margulis. And Latour makes a strange return to Carl Schmitt, if you read closely the Gifford Lectures. What Latour ends up saying is that we can't keep listening to climate change deniers indefinitely. They're a minority. Maybe they're 3% of the scientists. Maybe it's in the United States, it's probably all of Trump's supporters, or most of them. So maybe 35% of people are climate change deniers, maybe a few more. And we could go on endlessly having democratic debate with these people and avoiding settling the issue, just keep having more and more discussion about it. This is not what Latour wants. Latour wants Schmittian warfare against climate change skeptics in the Gaia Lectures. He doesn't want to kill them, it doesn't seem, but he wants to stop listening to them. He says it is time for the governments of the world simply to act, because our way of life is going to be destroyed, and possibly our whole civilization is going to be destroyed if climate change continues galloping full speed ahead. It may even already be too late, but we can at least try to do something. So climate change became the main political object of Latour's late career. And you'll notice, of course, that climate change is a great example of a form of politics that involves non-human actors. Yes, I realize the point of the Anthropocene is that humans are primarily responsible for generating climate change. Yes. Even so, it's not so much a question of who created it as of who can control it now, and humans simply cannot control it, at least with the current state of geoengineering. And even if we could do geoengineering and modify the climate, that would be a political debate. Who gets to do the geoengineering? There's been this scenario written about who are the countries most threatened by climate change immediately. Well, you could say all the Pacific Islands, the other island nations like the Maldives. Bangladesh is very low-lying land, your neighbor in India. Netherlands in Europe is very low-lying land. What if the Netherlands or Bangladesh had access to a technology that could geoengineer by, say, spreading sulfur dioxide gas into the atmosphere? This would actually slow and even reverse global warming by reflecting a lot of the sun's energy back into space. Okay, the problem is it's also going to create a lot more skin cancer. So people in Australia, which I don't know whether South Africa or Australia is closer to the pole, but one of these countries is the country with the most fair-skinned people close to the ozone hole, which means they're going to have the biggest skin cancer problem of any country on earth. And so you can imagine why countries like that would resist any move by the Bangladeshis and the Dutch to start geoengineering. I'm just naming these countries randomly. It could be different combinations of countries. Okay. Anyway, Latour thinks climate politics is still going to be very much in the realm of power politics, because you can't simply listen to people express vague doubts for decade after decade. Eventually, some serious action is going to have to be taken. This brings us to Latour's next book in that series, Down to Earth, where Trump is one of his main subjects, Donald Trump. And he has a very interesting reading of Trump, I think. Enemies of Trump in the United States, including myself, often speak loosely of Trump as a fascist. And there are certain elements of his public persona, like calling on his audience members to beat up people who disagree with him and things like that, that sound like they're from the fascist playbook. Latour, however, says that calling Trump a fascist is an anachronism, that fascism belonged to a time of radio as the chief mass medium, the time of mass industrialization and a mass number of industrial workers, combined with failing electoral politics and an economic crisis, 1930s primarily. His diagnosis of Trump is that Trump is not a fascist, but an escapist, that he's the first escapist at the level of global politics. What does that mean? It means that for Latour, the two pressing political issues of our time are, number one, climate change, and related to that, number two, refugees and forced migration. The two play into each other. Climate change is only going to increase that sort of migration, just as warfare does. See how many Syrians are in Turkey, or see how many refugees are other places. India or Sri Lanka may end up having to take the residents of the Maldives. Things like that. Certain people are going to lose their land because of the climate and because of more wars. And at a time when we most need to be confronting these issues head on, Latour accuses Trump of simply pretending that these issues don't exist, as though we could go back to the 1950s and simply not do anything about fossil fuels, and some Republicans simply want to shoot any immigrants who try to cross our border and kill them. A very cruel thing to do, but also not a very realistic political response to the fact that there's going to be a lot of refugees, and the US and Canada simply have a lot more open lands than most countries. And so we are probably going to have to do more of our share in resettling these people, even though a large part of the American public does not wish to do it. So the point being that climate politics is going to force us to deal with the politics of things, whether it's in trying to modify the level, like reduce the level of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, maybe to increase somewhat the level of sulfur dioxide, maybe to empower certain other technologies, even if they are not profitable yet, maybe to use force against some limited level of force, or maybe more against people who simply refuse to stop doing things that hurt the environment. You may recall that in the 1970s, there was the ban of chlorofluorocarbons coming from certain aerosols, and there was a treaty to ban those, and it seemed to have worked for a long time. The levels in the atmosphere of that chemical seem to have gone way down. But now it turns out that in the last few years, they are increasing again, which could mean two things. One thing, it could mean that one or more countries are cheating and are producing and using this chemical. It's hard to tell exactly who would be doing this. It's coming from somewhere in Asia, it seems, based on the best scientific evidence. The other possibility is that it's simply from old refrigerators and landfills breaking down, in which case it's nobody's fault. And maybe we need to find a way to counteract that. We have a certain limited amount of electric vehicle politics in the US, where the state of California and President Biden both are giving me and my wife money back this year because we bought a Tesla, even though we are economically better off than all the single mothers and all the working class people in this country, who could probably benefit more from tax relief or refunds from the government. But the point is that in order to get us to buy an electric car this year instead of 5 years from now, we needed that incentive. So that's another case where objects can become a central issue of politics. And there will be others. And this, it may not feed back into Latour's idea of morality, But it does fit nicely with Latour's prior idea of a politics of things and the fact that we need to let our politics orbit around things. Now, I just want to close by saying that whenever I talk about a politics of things, there's usually more pushback from the left than from the right. And I've thought about why this is. And some of it, of course, has to do with the fact that the left is more involved in a politics of human imagination, because they don't just want what was traditionally here and to preserve what was traditionally here. They want to change society in some way. And we always think of the province of human change as being some sort of human decision, that it's human imagination that imagines a new political system where people are more equal or more empowered, where different genders or colors of people are in charge, things of this sort. And so as soon as you turn to things, it sounds like you're turning away from the human imagination. And I want to argue that that's not true. The reason people think this is because we tend to think of things politically as constraints on our behavior. Yes, it would be nice if we could go make colonies on the moon, but we can't because it's too expensive to build rockets and it's too hard to take enough oxygen up to the moon. It's too hard to take enough food up to the moon. So that's a constraint. That's a constraint that for now limits most humans to living on the earth. We can't produce unlimited food supplies for humans without a technological breakthrough because things constrain us. The fact that in order to create more farmland, you have to tear down forests, even rainforest. And this is something that's going to accelerate climate change all the more. So usually inanimate things are seen as party poopers in politics. They're things that limit human dreams. And primarily, the form this has taken in history is geographical determinism. The fact that some people see countries' foreign policies as often coldly determined by history and geography. And you can get a lot of insights this way. You can get a lot of insights by saying, well, geographically, it's no wonder that Russia is doing what they're doing in Ukraine, even though it's kind of harsh, a lot of human rights violations, but Russia has always needed that extra territory that they can give up in a retreat and then defeat the enemy later. That would be one. Another, the fact that why has the UK always focused on naval power rather than land power? Well, because they're an island. And then the United States effectively is an island because of the fact that Canada and Mexico have not for centuries posed a serious threat to the United States militarily. And so it's geography and it's also military theory. If you ever want to know about geographical and other environmental limits on human activity, you should read military theorists, even if you don't like wars, even if you don't like military people. Because military people have to take the world and its details more seriously than academics do as a rule. Don't forget, it was the US military that was the first to take climate change seriously after a small number of climate scientists. So I'm going to wrap up here because I know we're reaching the end of the time. I just want to say that that's often called political realism, but I don't think it's political realism. I think it is political actualism. That kind of military and geographical approach to history is simply a way of looking at what things are here and now, right now. The real also includes possibilities. It includes new potentials in the future, which may include new arrangements between nations and peoples. It may also include new arrangements with things. And I'll end with one final example of how non-human objects can change the political sphere. There was a story in The Economist. Yes, I know, neoliberal magazine, et cetera, but it's an interesting story in The Economist about cell phone use in Zambia, in Africa, an impoverished nation. At first, cell phone companies were only willing to establish service in the cities. They weren't willing to establish cell phone service in the mountainous remote regions. All right. But at some point, one of the cell phone companies, I can't remember which one it was, decided to try it out, to take a risk and to guarantee cell coverage to the whole of Zambia. And it turned out it was an incredible change in the country because people didn't like carrying money from the mountain villages down to the capital because they were frequently robbed. And so they began transferring money to each other using features on their mobile phones. They began to call their relatives in the capital more frequently. So it created more of a social bonds throughout the country. It enabled certain new resources, such as people who would give you money in exchange for cell phone credits or cell phone credits in exchange for money. And so the political geography of the country was completely changed by what we consider an inanimate object. And then you've got the bad side of it. You've got the effect that Twitter and Facebook had on American politics. And just to summarize briefly what that is, and then I'll stop. Facebook and Twitter want you to spend as much time on their platforms each day as possible, of course. And it turns out the main way for them to do that is to get you angry or to tell you things that you agree with, one of those two extremes. And so they figured out pretty quickly that if you figure out a person's political orientation and just keep feeding them more of what they want to hear and never tell them facts that inconveniently contradict what they believe politically, they're going to become more and more extreme in their views and more dead set in their views, and they're going to become less and less used to communicating people with differing political views. And that is what we have now in the United States. We have essentially two parties who think the other party is insane, who think the other party is destroying the country. And I'm not trying to be neutral on this. I think one of the sides is actually more likely to destroy the country by a long shot. But the space for political debate in the United States has essentially been eroded by Facebook and Twitter. It has been severely damaged by those media, and also the shrinking of newspapers that has resulted, the fact that we have less accurate and reliable journalism because of the fact that the internet has eroded the role of newspapers in human society and also of traditional mass media. So these are just a couple of small examples of how things are already affecting our politics. And of course, in the past, this has already happened with the printing press and the television, and you can't think of Hitler rising to power without radio and so forth. And the next one on our doorstep is surely, along with climate change, artificial intelligence. And so this is probably the major political issue we need to be focusing on right now. And Latour is going to give you a lot more tools to do that than Rousseau, I think, or Marx, or Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Schmitt. I think the time is now to turn away from the moralistic politics of empowerment and turn towards a politics focusing on the way that things actually structure the political space. So I'll stop there, having gone 5 minutes over, and take any questions people have.
Thank you, Professor Harman, for this enriching talk. It is always a learning experience to listen to you. Now I open this session to question, answer, observation. Audience, if you have any question, you can ask Professor Harman directly, or you may write them in the chat box.
And from where I'm sitting,
Sir, you are on mute.
oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was on mute. I was saying I can only see 5 people. I know there are more than that following online, but
Sir, I have a question.
yes.
But, today we are talking about post-human entities, non-human factors.
Yes.
So, how do you see these non-human factors as active participants in politics of tomorrow?
Right. Along with technologies and along with things such as climate entities, such as the CO2 in the atmosphere, I should have added that I don't just mean inanimate things without humans. Sometimes I mean combinations of inanimate things with humans. Modernism, of course, is shaped by Descartes' cogito, the idea that we're all just thinking things. And in a good sense, that's been part of the engine of democracy in the modern period, the idea that we're all, in some sense, equal, and that the differences between us are, in some sense, accidental. But there's also the fact that we have differing commitments and differing obligations based on our attachment to certain inanimate things, such as pieces of land, such as certain ideas, such as free navigation of the seas. We also, Max Scheler, the great German philosopher who wrote about ethics, his main critique of Kantian ethics, and this isn't politics, but it's ethics, it's got some relation, the idea that Kantian ethics is too abstract, too formalistic and cold. It has too much to do with the idea of everyone having the same universal duty to act in such a way that our action becomes a universal law, that no one should ever lie, and things like this. One of the virtues, I think, of Max Shaler's alternative ethics is the idea that different people have different ethical obligations. So you saw this during the pandemic when doctors and nurses risked their lives treating COVID patients, and many of them died. If you think about a place like Italy, in northern Italy, where they lost hundreds, if not thousands, of doctors who simply never would have thought about not going to work. Well, that's not my ethical obligation. My ethical obligation was to protect myself sitting at home and wearing a mask if I went out. So that's a simple example of differing ethical obligations. Shaler thought also not only certain professions, but certain nationalities had different ethical callings. That in certain countries, military service is something people do proudly and willingly. Certain other countries, people are more willing to buy their way out of it or to see it as something that it's the duty of another economic class to do. And so we do find certain national ethical duties pressing on ourselves as well, that we feel like we are responsible for defending our country in particular, or for making up for wrongs that our countries did in the past. So, I never persecuted a Native American or, as far as I know, oppressed a Black American. And yet I recognize that our country has certain grave moral duties with respect to those groups based on wrongs done to them in the past. And all of this is really opened up by Shaler by his trying to make Kantian ethics less abstract. And I think the key there is that ethics is not just about people. Ethics is about people in combination with something else. So a person in combination with the fact that they are Italian, or the fact that they are a doctor and need to go in for COVID, or the fact that soldiers should not be cowards and should be willing to risk their lives in battle. These are professional responsibilities. So I have a special professional responsibility as a philosophy professor not to plagiarize. Hopefully no one plagiarizes in society, but if say a police officer plagiarizes something and puts it on the bulletin board, it's not that serious. Whereas if I or my colleagues who are university professors were to plagiarize someone else's research, this is a truly grave, unethical act, more so than it would be for normal people. We are more harsh ethically on a mother who slaps her child than on a stranger who slaps the child in some respects, even though we will put the stranger in prison. Because you expect the mother to have a lot of love for the child. And so you judge her more severely in ethical terms sometimes than you would a stranger. Anyway, politically, what this would mean is that we are not all just cogitos. We all have certain commitments. Latour often asked, if you want to know what somebody is really committed to, ask what is worth more for them than life itself. What would they be willing to die for? That's not the only question you can ask, but it's one of those questions. What would somebody die to protect? And for many people, it's their families or their country or their certain cherished ideas. But if you look a little more closely, you're going to find even more things that certain people or certain nations are unwilling to live without and are willing to risk their life to attain or preserve. So if we just start looking at politics not in terms of people alone, but in terms of people in combination with inanimate entities. And since we're talking about posthumanism, some of this may be cybernetic. Some of this may have to do with the fact that we are going to be enhancing our humanity with certain technologies. How should these technologies be distributed? Should they only be distributed through the market? Is it going to be a problem if only billionaires have brain chips that enhance their intelligence? Well, yeah, probably. So that's going to be probably where we're looking for the political issues of the near future, is the horizon where human meets non-human. Because posthumanism is about to stop being just an academic topic. It's about to start becoming an everyday topic. And it's going to transform our politics radically.
Thank you, Professor Harman. There is another question in the chat box.
Sure.
Govert Scholar has asked you. I hope you can see it in the chat box.
Which one? Which one is it?
Govert Scholar. What would be the ontological status of tractors in farmers' protest? For example, in the EU, leading the scrapping of environmental policies, what would Latour recommend?
Latour would probably be fascinated with this use of objects. Levi Bryant has also argued for paying more attention to infrastructure in protest, blocking highways, blocking ports, blocking airports. Governments tend to crack down on these pretty hard because they paralyze the government pretty quickly. But the use of tractors is good. Also, the very introduction of tractors changed the nature of farming. I know there was some pressure from the World Bank on Indian farming to try to move towards more larger farms as opposed to smaller family ones, and I know this created a lot of political problems. You had a lot of farmers being put out of business, maybe. You had the exploitation of some of the Indian farmers by Monsanto. And so anytime a new object is introduced, it changes politics. I mentioned Ivan the Terrible earlier. Well, for, I don't know, maybe 2,000 years of human history, civilizations lived in terror of nomads like the Mongols and others who would come in from the steppe and destroy their cities and burn them. Well, we forget sometimes that the only reason we don't still have those nomads sweeping in and burning cities is because of the invention of modern cannon. That was the only thing that first gave civilization the upper hand against the nomads and allowed cities to become somewhat safer. And why cities are now so dominant on the planet, it's because their natural enemy, the herders, who were enemies of cities and farmers, would come in and destroy those places. And artificial intelligence is no doubt going to do something equally explosive. We just don't know what yet. And we just hope it doesn't happen so fast that we're wiped out before we have a chance to assess the situation. So, again, for your question about objects and protests, I think that's a very good idea, very effective tactic, because the sphere of politics is made of things. I see another question at the bottom. Kumar Sawan, should I answer that?
Yes, Professor, if you have time.
I do.
Just this case.
One book I would recommend is anything by James Lovelock, because then you can read about Gaia theory and how not only humans, but other living creatures help modify the atmosphere. We essentially live in a world that is created by the pollution of other living creatures. We breathe oxygen, but oxygen was put there by cyanobacteria. And initially, oxygen was so dangerous for most life forms that very few creatures could survive in the oxygen. And the ancestors of humans were able to evolve in such a way as to be able to process that oxygen and thrive in it. And it was Lovelock's career-beginning idea, in a sense, that you don't have to go explore Mars in person to know if there's life there. You can just look at the atmosphere. And if you look at the atmosphere of Mars, you'll see that it's chemically inert. The chemistry of the atmosphere is very stable, which means there are probably no life forms messing with the chemistry of the atmosphere. If you look at the Earth's atmosphere, however, you're going to see a very unstable chemical mix, so that an alien simply analyzing Earth's atmosphere could probably know for sure that there's life here. For example, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but the percentage of oxygen in our atmosphere is maybe something like 23 to 25%. If it were just a few percent higher, all of the forests in the world would catch on fire as soon as there's a lightning strike, because oxygen is a very dangerous gas, very flammable. We like it because we breathe it to live. But the fact that we and other animals are here breathing it is the only thing that keeps oxygen from getting too high. Otherwise, the plants would be excreting too much of it, and then the plants would kill themselves by causing forest fires that burn them all. So plants are lucky that animals are here to breathe some of their excess oxygen. And we are lucky that plants are here to process our CO2 back into oxygen. And this is the center of Lovelock's whole theory, that the Earth's, not only the Earth's climate, the Earth's geology was affected by living creatures. Why the geology? Well, because many of our rocks are formed of seashells and of dead creatures, limestone. And also because in Gaia theory, there's an idea now that earthquakes and the movement of continents was caused by life, in the sense that as sea creatures died and fell to the bottom of the ocean floor, that it started piling up a lot of weight, started creating cracks in the ocean floor, and that's why the continents started moving, and that's why there's earthquakes and volcanoes, because too many dead animals hit the bottom of the seafloor. So that's quite a fascinating idea. So I would recommend, I'll type here the books of James Lovelock when it comes to Gaia theory. Also, for sure, the books of Lynn Margulis when it comes to evolution. Symbiotic Planet is a good one of hers to start with. She's one of the most exciting science writers I know. Her idea is that Darwin has the wrong mechanism for evolution. It's not big animals eating little animals and reproducing bigger babies. It's primarily about symbiosis between, say, a human and bacteria or viruses. That's how we evolve. Not through killing each other, but through making new symbioses. So, okay, we all got COVID, and it killed a lot of people, but it also maybe gave a new capability to humans in the long run. The COVID virus is still there. It may be making us immune to something else, or maybe it's making us 2 IQ points smarter. I'm just making this up. I don't know. It's possible that COVID added something to the human genome that makes us stronger or smarter. You never know. A lot of viruses have done this. My wife and I had a virus that we caught in Sweden in 2015, and we've never really recovered from it. And luckily, these are minor effects, but we've noticed we are both a little different since that flu virus or whatever it was in Sweden. And so it's known that viruses can do this. Someone's saying that in this context, the aurora light from the north is also getting further south. I think that's true. I didn't know it was about the atomic bomb causing the Earth to shift its center. I did watch a movie, a short video, where some of the Inuits, used to be called the Eskimos, in the northern latitudes of Canada and elsewhere, were insisting that the sun no longer rises in the same place that it used to when their ancestors were alive. One of the wise people of the Inuits said, I can tell you for sure the sun has moved. It used to rise over there, and now it rises over this mountain. And of course, Western scientists were saying that's impossible. The sun has not changed its position. But then they realized the Inuit were right. The pollution near the North Pole had made it look like the sun was in a different place. It was changing the refraction of the sun's light. And so they actually had something to teach us. We just didn't know what they were saying. They were right. Their observation was correct that the sun had moved, but it was a result of human pollution. One of the interesting things about Lovelock is he tells us not to worry as much about pollution in the usual way. We tend to worry about litter, which is ugly, like plastic wrappers along the side of the road or people throwing cans out. No, that's not nice. Yes, we should do that, and I suppose we should recycle. But we should worry about nuclear power disasters. But Lovelock reminds us that the ultimate pollution that really endangers us is carbon dioxide. Methane is worse, but there's not as much of it in the atmosphere. It's really about carbon dioxide. That's the most dangerous pollution. We have to find ways to lower it. And maybe we could plant a huge new forest somewhere. I hear that India is already very good about planting more trees, that they require students to do it. Is that true? No? I thought I read somewhere that in certain parts of India, all school children are required to plant trees. And that's a good idea, I think. Good idea to get people in the habit of planting trees. If you fly on the airplane now, after COVID, my first long trip was from Los Angeles to Dubai. I was invited to speak there. And I was glad to get out of the house, but now they are printing at the bottom of the ticket how much CO2 you're adding to the atmosphere when you fly on the plane. It's designed to make you think twice. And I remember calculating the numbers. And in order for me to pay for my carbon-wise for my round trip from Los Angeles to Dubai and back, I would need to plant 6 trees that live for 75 years to remove the carbon dioxide I created just on that one trip. And so this needs to become a normalized thing, I guess. And then there are policy things, because we can't just do it by planting trees. We're going to need to move away from fossil fuels. And we may need to do some geoengineering, as risky as that sounds. Sir Francis Fukuyama in Political Posthumanism has a skeptical stance over transhuman advancements are a danger to democracies. Okay, I can see the possible dangers of a danger to democracy. We have to remember that Fukuyama is still coming from a somewhat conservative standpoint. I wouldn't call him an outright right-winger, but he's someone who takes seriously the lessons of history. And there's always a danger of technological advance politically. Atomic weapons were considered a great danger, and they still might be a danger. There might still be a nuclear war at some time, but so far it hasn't happened. So far it has done what its proponents said, and it's made countries think twice before fighting each other. We would probably already have a war between Russia and NATO and Ukraine if there were not nuclear weapons on both sides. That's one example. And so in a sense, I hope it doesn't get worse. I hope they're not involved. The biggest danger for transhumanism, maybe, one would be that things change so fast that one group gains an advantage over another group and destroys the rest. Another variant of that would be that the wealthy class takes advantage of their position to technologically enhance their minds and bodies in a way that the rest of us can't afford. And so that people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are essentially becoming versions of artificial intelligence, so that we can't possibly engage with and debate with them or economically compete against them. because they've essentially become the machines that they are building now. I'm at an architecture school, and so I see what is happening with the introduction of AI technology into architecture and into the writing classes I teach, or the writing assignments I give at an architecture school. Now, in architecture, it leads to very beautiful results. Students make absolutely beautiful work that looks professional quality with the use of Midjourney and other software. The danger is that someone might be over-relying on that, or that architects might all lose their jobs in the future because artificial intelligence is designing all the buildings. And likewise, in the writing classes, I am suspicious that the student papers I get now are much better than the student papers I ever got in the past. And I don't think student writing is getting better. I think they're finding ways to use technologies to turn in better papers. And I guess I don't mind if they're doing grammar checks on their writing, but we might have to go back to the days of oral exams where you're questioning the student in person. I've done that in Italy when I taught there. I used to do it here at the school, but then I realized they wanted me to teach writing. But eventually we'll probably have to go back to oral exams so we know which students really know what they're talking about and which are just using technology. On the other hand, I have a different view of this than most people. I actually am not as panicked about the idea that in the future, all architecture, all art, all novels, all philosophy books might be written by AI. And the reason I'm not is because, for me, the reason I write philosophy books is because I want to be able to read them. I want to be able to read a philosophy book that I agree with, so I have to write it myself. And even if the AI is writing philosophy books for me, I'm still the one deciding which of those is the best, right? So humans are actually naturally more curators and connoisseurs and experts than they are creators. We need to create because until now, machines haven't been able to do it for us. Machines have not been good enough to make paintings that are of high quality. Now they're getting there. They're getting there. And so maybe instead of the painter, the art figure of the future is going to be the curator, which is already sort of happening. I noticed in the last couple of decades, a lot of art students wanted to be curators, not artists, which signals there's something going on. There's a shift in the meaning of art. That maybe art can still be a creative pursuit, but maybe people are starting to see the creativity in curatorial pursuits or in critical pursuits, that of the art critic or the architecture critic. And I don't think humans are ever going to want artificial intelligence to tell us what the best paintings are. I can imagine telling artificial intelligence, please paint me 50 paintings that look like Rembrandt. But I still want to, I'm not going to ask the artificial intelligence, now rank them for me, best to worst. No, I want to rank them best to worst. As a human, I want to be the one who decides what's great art and what's not. That's the whole, there's no point in living if you just have the machine do that for you. I don't mind as much if I don't have to write the philosophy books 50 years from now. This probably won't happen in my lifetime, but it might. It might get to the point where instead of philosophers or philosophy authors, you are having philosophy aggregators who have websites where they recommend the 10 best AI-written philosophy books. And some of those people get a reputation as having trustworthy judgments, just like certain art critics already do. I'm still thinking maybe 40, 50 years down the line, maybe it won't take that long, but it wouldn't alarm me that much. I'm only going to be alarmed if they start killing us, if they start brainwashing us, start lying to us. They're already saying, don't abuse your GPS system or Siri on your iPhone because they might kill you 20 years from now when they can. If you insult Siri and call her bad names, maybe she will have weapons attached to her in 20 years. Can shoot missiles at you. So be careful what you say to your machines today. Be careful what you say to ChatGPT today. Margaret Atwood's. Well, when The Handmaid's Tale first came out, was that the 90s or the 80s? It was a while ago, the novel. I thought she was exaggerating probably the political situation, but in the last few years, there have been steps back for women's rights in the United States and maybe some other countries. And so I think maybe if you think of post-humanism as allowing political control over certain groups, there is a worry there. There is a worry that this basically democratic space where we're supposed to share information is in danger. And that we are going to go back to a Hobbesian situation where the sovereign makes all the decisions and we're just supposed to shop and buy things and go to concerts. So maybe Margaret Atwood's trilogy was not too pessimistic. I don't know. I know we're all more worried politically than we've been in a long time. I suppose, in the Cold War, people were worried about nuclear war. Maybe in the 90s, many people were worried a little less about politics, at least in the Western world. And now we're all politically panicked. We don't know what the world's going to look like in 10 years. And it's a scary thing. And it's not just about wars, it's also about technologies. I read it. I'll stop there because there's only 1 minute left. Dreyfus and computers. That'll be the last one I ask. I tend to agree with Dreyfus about the things computers can't do. However, I'm not sure that it matters that computers aren't sentient. Instead of calling it artificial intelligence, because I'm not really sure it's intelligent, I would call it simulated intelligence. And for many practical purposes, simulated intelligence is close enough to real intelligence that it doesn't matter whether it thinks or not. So if there could be androids walking around on the streets, and I can't tell the difference between them and a human, in some ways it doesn't matter if they're not really human. They're still able to affect my decisions and my actions as if they really were humans. So, but as far as Dreyfus's critique of the limits of computers, I think those are still pretty good, his ideas. Okay. I'll make way for the next speaker. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor Graham Harman. I thank you again for this wonderful talk, and it is indeed going to be a cherished memory for us all. And I would like to remind our audience that Professor Harman first gave a lecture on Latour and the Way Forward, and that was given under our lecture series, in memoriam lecture series, and it is uploaded on our CRP YouTube channel. And recently, it has just crossed 1,000 plus viewers. And
that's nice. That's nice.
The most viewers among the all lectures that have been uploaded on our CRP YouTube channel. So thank you, Professor Graham Harman, and good night.
All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.